Hi, and welcome to All Points Bulletin on therapycable.com, where we talk about sometimes hot and controversial issues that are affecting our communities. And I would like to welcome my guest, Marissa Presley, who has worked for Laura's House for the past 8 years. Not only is Marissa a domestic violence advocate, but she's also a teacher and an educator. Marissa's also a survivor, too, and I've heard her story many a times, and she's an extremely strong woman. And I will have to also say that Marissa has not only been a mentor to some of my current, but also former students, including myself. I sat in, probably about 2 years ago, I sat in a domestic violence training with Marissa, 40-hour training, and I will tell you, that was probably one of the best domestic violence trainings I've ever sat in on. The education was just unbelievable. Yeah. And, you know, as a law enforcement officer, I've had different types of training, whether it be federal or state, and I will tell you, though, listening to some of the victims and people that you brought in really opened my eyes to, you know, how we need to really start looking at domestic violence. So, again, thank you, Marissa, for coming.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Good. Well, one of the things we're going to break this into two parts is really kind of understanding what domestic violence is about and why abusers abuse and why victims are victims.
Okay. I think that's a great start. Why abusers abuse? Everybody asks that question. Why does he do that? One of the answers that I often get is he or she abuses because they were victimized as children. Maybe they had a rough childhood. Maybe they're under a lot of stress. Maybe the drugs or the alcohol was the influence.
Right.
Maybe they have anger control issues. I've also heard that maybe it's the victim's fault. If the victim, male or female, would just, not say the things that she or he said or do the things that they did or just shut up, not push buttons, then the abuse wouldn't happen. I've also heard that maybe domestic violence happens because of the cultural norms. It's in my culture.
Correct.
That's the way it is, But I know a lot of people who have had rough childhoods, including myself. I've known a lot of people who have anger control issues, who have use of alcohol, and they don't beat anybody up. I'm under a lot of stress, as is most of the world under a lot of stress, and I don't beat people up because it's a choice. And the reason why abusers abuse is because of the need to have power and control over their partner. And the things that they have to control are things like where are you at, who are you with, who are you talking to, who are you hanging out with, what took you so long to get here, your time, who you speak to, who you look at, your cell phone, your internet use, your social networking activity. And if the perpetrator does not believe that they can control their victim, they will do whatever it takes, even if it means punching a woman unconscious in an elevator or beating up a woman in a vehicle like Ray Rice did or Chris Brown did to their partners.
Do you think it also stems from how we've been brought up? I know a bit about your background, and you're right. Not all of us who grew up in bad situations turn out to be, batterers or victims. But do you think that not dealing with our own trauma as children really has a profound effect on who we pick as a partner or who we pick? So can you just describe that a little bit more, too?
Absolutely. I agree with you, Vanessa. Of course, growing up in domestic violence or in a violent home, the chances are you will learn that behavior and mimic it when you start dating. But because domestic violence is a learned behavior, it can also be unlearned. And I think that, for example, me, when I was growing up in an abusive home and watching my father brutally beat my mama regularly, I thought that was just normal and that's just the way kids grow up and that's the way life is. I did not know that you could have a healthy relationship. So the choices that I made were unhealthy when I started dating. And also I think it has a lot to do not just with how you were brought up, but your self-worth.
Wow, yeah, and that's been a very big topic, especially when we talk about, self-esteem.
Yeah.
And I also think, too, that most of the victims or people that I've worked with have such low self-image, that they stay in a relationship because that's really all that they deserve. And
a lot of victims do feel that way. And then there's a lot of victims, survivors like us, who are independent, have high self-esteem, really like ourselves and value who we are, high confidence, who might fall prey to an abuser, because the way that domestic violence begins, it's very gradual.
Right.
It's not a slap in the face or a punch or a kick, on the first or second date. It's about manipulation and guilt tripping and playing mind games and verbal abuse. And that sort of behavior, the victim survivor, we dismiss that.
Right.
Or we make excuses for it.
Right.
So yeah, low self-esteem, it has a lot to do with why we would enter into an abusive relationship. But I know a lot of women who have, esteem for themselves, who have also fallen prey to that.
Right.
Or men.
Right. Mm-hmm. And as much as we talk about high self-esteem, but that's a work in progress.
Absolutely, every day.
And I think that's where kind of a misnomer that people think, well, you're educated and you're strong, but self-esteem is also something that you have to continually contribute to yourself.
Yeah, it's like that self-talk, right? Mm-hmm. That little talk in your brain telling you that you're good enough and pretty enough and smart enough.
Right.
And when you're living in an abusive relationship, it is the constant degradation of the human soul with things like, you could never do anything right. Why are you doing that?
Right.
Shut that off. Stop your whining. You're so sensitive. Can't you take a joke? And those things are so constant and they're every day, that it helps to lower the esteem of the human being. And I want to make something clear for all of your viewers, is that domestic violence happens to males too. It does not only happen to females. Female and male violence is very prevalent. It's just that it's unreported.
Correct.
Who is a man going to tell? He's not going to tell his buddies. They're going to make fun of him. And also domestic violence happens in homosexual and heterosexual relationships as well. And
which is also a category that's extremely underreported.
Oh, it's
it's
underreported, it's underserved, and nobody really wants to talk about it. Even in our own community of the gay and lesbian, queer community, we don't want to talk about it because it's dirty talk, and we don't want anybody to know. The thing that I think people would be most surprised to hear about domestic violence is that it happens to 10-year-olds and 12-year-olds who are right now dating.
Right.
They're like in the 7th grade and they're having these intense relationships. And, teenagers in Orange County, for example, 1 out of every 4 is being physically beaten up by their boyfriend or girlfriend. Think about that. 1 out of every 4 teenagers is being punched, kicked, slapped, pushed, shoved by their boyfriend or girlfriend. That's an epidemic, if you ask me.
So again, where it is so high, I know in the next segment we're going to talk about more of the red flags and things to pay attention to, but I guess what I'm saying is that at what point do we really need to start educating on what a healthy relationship looks like? And I think the hard part about it is when you grow up and you're a witness, similar to what you spoke about yourself, you don't know the difference between right and wrong.
Yeah, that's true. I think we should start educating now. So whatever that means to you, if your kid is 8 years old, this is the time to start. If your child is 16, it is absolutely never too early and never too late. And, watching television programs, for example, the most popular shows on TV, just really pay attention to how much violence against men is on those programs.
Right.
Take a moment to pause and say to your child, this is unacceptable. And if this happens to you, there is help. And a woman should not treat a man like that, or vice versa. But I think that the key here is to educate and to bring in professionals into the elementary schools, middle schools, and high schools. Laura's House, we already do that to middle schools, high schools, colleges, universities. But we need to start younger, because studies show that 70% of 7th graders are already dating right now. They identify as having a partner. And also, what we have to consider is that it goes beyond the digital abuse of, threatening text messages. We're talking about very severe physical violence and threats that lead to murder.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you're right. In the digital world, too, sexting and all the issues that we've had, kids really putting themselves out there in unfortunate situations that have, long lifetime effects on what happens to them.
Yeah, that's the most extreme would be, death from a partner. But it is not rare. It's actually very common, and it happens all the time. It actually happens here in Orange County, California.
Right. And I know, like I said, we're going to get into some of the red flags about it, too. But parents, we need to, again, I think part of the education piece obviously has to begin at home. And I think when parents tend to look at their own relationships, they, as many times as I've been to a domestic violence call as a law enforcement officer, first thing you ask is, where were your kids when this happened? And you hear, well, they weren't in the same room.
Yeah.
And just because kids may not be a direct witness to an incident or an episode, don't think that they don't hear it, and the silent treatment, the verbal abuse, the the look, all the dynamics that happen within the family really get translated into a lot of these young relationships as well.
Absolutely. So, kids who grow up in an abusive home will most likely mimic that behavior. But we have also a lot of teens who come from a very healthy environment who might also become the abuser because now they're mimicking what their friends are doing and how their friends treat their partners at middle school or high school. I think that the key, and it'll always be the key, is the prevention of domestic violence with education. And that's going to be, for me, that's my passion.
Right. Thank you. Now we're going to take a short commercial break, and we'll come back with Marissa for the second half.
Hi, welcome to Adelante. This is Adelante Recovery, and my name is Yvette Kuglin, and I'm part of the staff.
Adelante Recovery Center has helped people in dual diagnosis for 5 years. We accept most PPO insurances and provide luxury accommodations and 24-hour support. To speak with an admissions counselor, call 1-888-242-4450.
A lot of time we don't even know what's wrong with us, and sometimes we need to get away to figure that out. So if you want to go for a little retreat out in Corona Del Mar, which is a confidential location, we're here to help. So we're only a phone call away. Thank you.
Hi, and welcome back to All Points Bulletin. My guest, Marissa Presley. So one of the things that we talked about in the first half is really what domestic violence was about, and understanding that there's a lot of people that are involved in abusive relationships. So one of the things we're going to discuss now is what are the red flags, or what we would call red flags, things that people should be aware of, or maybe subconsciously that they're not picking up that they should start to pick up. So I'm just going to kind of hand it over to you to kind of identify some of the things that a victim, a batterer, friends, parents should pay attention to.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I actually created a comprehensive list of red flags on our Laura's House website. But just think about the things that your gut tells you is not right. And if your gut, your instinct tells you there's something about this date that is not flowing anymore, I'm not that comfortable with the comment or the gesture that was done, that's a red flag. You don't have to wait for the person to slap you to see the red flag. The red flags are there for you to recognize them. One red flag on your first date would be, how does your date treat the service personnel? How do they treat the waitress, the busboy, the cashier? And there's this gesture that, they do this to the waiter. That's so rude. If they are rude to the waiter, they're going to be rude to you. How do they view women just in general? How do they treat their mother and their sisters? How do they speak of women? And for those men and women who date women, how does that woman view herself? Because if she has issues with men and you're a man, she's going to have issues with you. Another red flag to look for is the date that you're on already on their second martini? And you haven't even got the appetizers yet, that's a red flag. A red flag is also, do they blame others for all of their circumstances in life? Yes. Do they blame the professor because they didn't get, to pass the class? They blame the cop because they got a speeding ticket. They blame their boss because they didn't get that promotion. So do they blame others for their circumstances in life? That's a red flag. The number one red flag to be looking for, and I tell this to all the parents, is jealousy. That possessiveness, the questioning and the interrogations of where are you at and who are you with, that's constant.
Right.
Jealousy is nothing to be flattered about. It's an extremely dangerous person because jealous people will put you down, lower your self-esteem, then they will keep tabs on you and control you.
Right. And again, I think that part of what our viewers need to understand, too, is that this is not something that just happens day one. And as I have taught the semester, I was teaching a lot on domestic violence, and I asked my students, how many of you guys would go out with a guy again if, you had a great date and really a lot of fun, and as he goes to give you a kiss goodnight, he punches you in the face. You know, those are not domestic violence red flags. You know what I mean? It doesn't
Exactly.
happen that way.
Yeah.
And I think that's,
agree.
we have to kind of pay attention to that. This domestic violence may not start the first couple of dates.
Nope.
It may be months into it, and
Yes.
if not years into it.
There's actual grooming.
Correct.
Because, see, first of all, the domestic violence perpetrator is going to pick a victim. And the perpetrator is not going to pick somebody who has a voice and uses that voice and speaks up and has an opinion. They're mostly going to be looking for somebody that's more timid, that or maybe they'll pick somebody powerful who they think that they can control and make it a game. You know, not all abusers have low self-esteem. Not all abusers grew up in abusive homes. Some of them have a very high self-esteem. They might be even narcissistic in a way. But the thing about red flags is that you don't have to look at a comprehensive list. You can make up your own list. And then review that list before you go on the date. And if any one of those red flags shows up, that's your cue to walk out of that date safely now. You know what another red flag is that I think a lot of people don't notice is how do they speak to you? Do they say things to you like when you order the rack of ribs at Claim Jumper? Are you going to eat all that? They're criticizing you. So look at how they speak to you. The word shut up, that's another red flag.
Right.
And look at the red flag, recognize it, pay attention to it, and be able to walk away from that early on in the relationship. Because by the time you hear the word shut up again, it'll be attached with the punch in the face.
Right.
Yeah, it's gradual.
You know, and some of the things that we've talked about before, I think for a lot of us, we never grow up really listening to our gut feeling. You know, our gut feeling gives us a lot of indicators that I don't think we listen to our inner voice a lot. You know, and again, when you do interviews afterwards, you'll often hear victims say, well, I should have known.
Yes.
I don't know why I didn't listen to this, and this.
I think that we don't listen to our gut, Vanessa, because we don't want to be rude.
You know? You're absolutely right. I think that if we did listen to our gut, maybe we're questioning whether our filter is okay or whether or not, you know, we're taking things out of context or what have you. But I think for a lot of victims, when they really reflect back to the relationship, the red flags were there. It was the gut feeling that we never paid attention to.
Absolutely. I get to hear that a lot from my victim survivors and me as well, looking back at some of the choices that I've made in partners, not really honoring that voice inside of me that says, you know, stay away, you're going to get hurt. A lot of us also do not listen to our gut, not only because we don't want to be rude, but because, you know, we feel like everybody deserves a chance and we don't want to judge somebody. But your gut instinct is just that. It's an instinct. It's there to protect you. So that could be the number one red flag to look for is you're getting ready to go on that date, curling your hair, and you start to get a stomach ache. That's a red flag. That's your stomach, your gut telling you. You know, men are really good at using their gut instinct. They don't question it. They just move forward with that choice. And I get to work with a lot of men survivors as well, and women survivors. And I just read a study the other day. It was really interesting that teen girls are actually more physically aggressive than teen boys.
Yeah. Okay.
Is that crazy?
There is a lot that we're not talking about, especially when it comes to the male victims as well.
Yes. You know, speaking of male victims, I have an event coming up, if you don't mind me talking
about it. No, not
it.
at all. I was hoping you would.
It's here in Tustin. It's at the Sheriff's Regional Training Facility. And it's a 1-hour event. It's a candlelight vigil in honor of Jackie Villagomez, who was a teen girl here, graduated from El Toro High School, who was beaten to death by her boyfriend. And so we just raise awareness on how often does this happen and who is it happening to. You actually might know somebody, or the person sitting right next to you today might be a victim, survivor of domestic violence. So come to our event. And the reason I want to invite you guys is because my keynote speaker is a male survivor, which is very rare.
Right.
You know, nobody wants to be the poster boy for being victimized, especially from a female. But he's just very brave, so I invite everybody to come join us.
Yeah, I had gone a couple years back with my students, and it's extremely powerful, too. I mean, not only do you ask us to hold candles in light for a victim, you know, who has been murdered by his or her boyfriend or significant other, but just to even have the display of people that we've lost was very powerful.
And the people that we are honoring are all, you know, teenagers.
Right.
Yeah, it's an epidemic. So I'm glad that we get to talk about it today. And if any of your viewers feel like they want to talk to somebody who will not judge them, will not even advise them, just listen and offer resources, at Laura's house, we offer those services. We have a 24-hour crisis hotline that can be reached any time during the day, weekends, holidays. And we are just...
And you can do that anonymously as well,
Absolutely.
Correct?
You can give a fake name, whatever you want. We also have a shelter for battered women and children. And unfortunately, in all of Orange County, there are no shelters for men, but I'm working on that.
Well, knowing you, I know it'll happen. So I guess one of the questions I always get when I do teach domestic violence is, how do we help a victim?
We help them by listening, number one. Number two, offering resources. And number three, being there for them, even if it takes 12 times that they break up with their abuser. Sound like a broken record. Offer resources, listen, and be there for them.
I think the other thing, too, is that when we work with victims, my action plan does not necessarily translate to somebody else's, what they're going through.
Yes,
you know
Vanessa,
what I mean?
yes,
So even though
agree.
I may say this woman and her children need to be moved to a shelter, it doesn't necessarily work for the victim that I'm dealing with.
Absolutely. That's why it's key when you are action planning or safety planning to encourage the victim survivor to do most of the planning, and you are just serving as an advocate for the resources that are available in Orange County.
Yeah, and you do hear it a lot, but how do I help my sister? How do I help my best friend? I know she's not in a good relationship. And I've done a lot of tabletop exercises with my students. And again, I think in my personal opinion, one of the biggest things is when you see somebody in not a healthy or a bad situation, it's basically having them to now think about safety.
Yeah.
So if you can't have them break up with their abuser, one of the best things that I think is just to say, well, I want you to just create some kind of safety plan.
Yeah.
What does that look like to you? Not to me, to you.
Exactly. Get them involved because it's their relationship, their life that's on the line here. And safety plans, you can Google safety plans online. Right. They're all over the place. But if you want to sit down one-on-one with me, I'll chat with you about a safety plan and how to get those, from the beginning point to the end point. But I think that the most important thing with safety planning is to do most of the listening.
Right. How often, and I've heard you speak about this before, but how many times does it take a victim to leave his or her abuser?
Yeah, victims usually end a relationship and then they return for the same reasons they couldn't leave in the first place: finances, children, love, fear. And then they return again. And it takes an average of 7 times of leaving and returning and leaving and returning to actually make a final escape. About 7, that's the average.
Which is hard. And again, on the law enforcement side, too, it's 7 plus how many times that officer, goes to the house or works with the victims or sends them to a shelter or works on getting them a victim advocate. There's a frustration level there, too.
Yeah,
and
it's very frustrating.
That's the hard part about it is that, again, we're dealing with other people's families. We're dealing with people's trauma. We're dealing with the unknown factor.
Yeah, and, I think a lot of people have expectations of the victim. They expect the victim to make a change, right, to get those resources, get out of that relationship, report it, start a foundation, speak up about it. When in reality, for me, for example, it took me 20 years to speak up about my experience. And the only thing I expect from a victim of any crime, domestic violence, rape, sexual assault, is for them to just try to remain alive. And our expectations that we put on victims, like you said earlier, they don't translate to the victim. The victim is confused and scared and sad, and she's not empowered or he's not empowered. And the victim is also really probably feel guilty. And now we expect that victim survivor to make this rational choice and leave the relationship when, rational thinking is not happening right now with the fear and the confusion.
And I also think that there's that... I don't know what the term you'd call it, but you almost fantasize about that person you first met.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, there is something magical when you start dating and, the chemistry.
The butterflies.
Exactly.
The honeymoon stage. And that honeymoon stage, that kindness from the perpetrator, it's still there in little pieces. And that's, called the honeymoon stage. And some of us victims, survivors, we tend to look at that stage and say, well, it could be worse. Things will get better. And when in reality, all experts of domestic violence conclude that it will get worse. Right. It starts off with the look in the eye, the intimidation, the questioning, to the pushing and shoving, to the beating, to the actual homicide, suicide.
Right, and I think that that's why it's important for us to understand the grooming phase. As I said before, you know, many of us would never go out on that date again if the first time we went out to dinner and instead of a kiss goodnight, you got a punch in the face.
Yeah.
So, again, there is being able to kind of realize that that may have been kind of a fantasy that, you know, the victim kind of really holds on to, and we really need to work with that as well.
Yeah, and you can work with that, you know, with the one-on-one talk therapist that will not judge you at Laura's house or any other agency.
Right. Well, Marissa, I truly appreciate your efforts. You're an amazing speaker and have really touched a lot of hearts. And like I said, I mean, my students come back and are just so blown away after sitting in on your 40-hour training, including myself. I will tell you, having spent 10 years in law enforcement and as many trainings that I've been to, some of your speakers really brought to light the human side versus what, you know, an arrestable offense is.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
And I think that that's really why, not only have I had you to ask you to come on here, but really to help our viewers understand that victims are frustrating. You know, this process is not easy.
No, it's not.
But helping a victim survive is really worthwhile.
Yeah,
so
it's my passion. I'll do it. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Again, thank you for watching All Points Bulletin on therapycable.com.